Kong's throne cavern stood empty, and the handprint in the stone was still warm. Marcus dropped to one knee beside it, his glove scraping across black dust and fresh splinters of crystal embedded in the rock like shrapnel. The air inside the chamber carried a harsh metallic smell, sharper than the usual mineral damp of hollow earth, and somewhere far below, a slow boom rolled through the ground like a buried heartbeat. Evelyn stepped past the broken boundary markers Monarch had planted months earlier, their blue signal lights blinking in nervous patterns, and aimed her scanner toward the tunnel mouth. The screen pulsed red, then flashed a trajectory line cutting away from Kong's known territory and straight into unmapped terrain. "He didn't wander," she said, her voice low as the cave lights flickered over her face. "He left fast." Behind them, the research team hesitated at the edge of the chamber, listening to pebbles tick down the tunnel walls. No one had ever logged Kong abandoning this region for more than a few hours. Marcus rose, looked once at the deep gouges in the stone floor, then grabbed the lead cable of the descent skiff himself and dragged it toward the opening. "We go now," he said. "If he's moving like this, something pushed him." That decision snapped the room into motion. Winches screamed. Harness clips slammed shut. Flood lamps painted the tunnel in white bars that shook across wet basalt and hanging roots thick as ship ropes. Evelyn climbed into the front cradle with the scanner braced against her knee, and Marcus took the outer rail instead of a protected seat, one boot hooked under a support strut as the skiff tipped forward into the shaft. The drop swallowed them whole. Cold wind knifed upward from the abyss, carrying the smell of sulfur, moss, and something burnt. Bioluminescent spores drifted around them in green clouds, sticking to Marcus's jacket and the metal rails like ash. Far beneath, hollow earth opened in impossible layers, upside-down cliffs, glowing rivers suspended in the distance, and forests hanging from stone like entire worlds turned sideways. The skiff shuddered as it crossed a gravity shear, bolts shrieking under the strain. One of the researchers cursed and nearly lost his grip, but Evelyn was already leaning out, eyes fixed on the scanner. "Signal spike," she said. "Massive. He passed through here less than an hour ago." Then the first warning hit. A flock of spine-wing scavengers burst from a crack in the cliff wall, their needle cries slicing through the tunnel as they swarmed the skiff's lights. The pilot jerked sideways. Cables snapped taut. One winged body slammed the floodlamp cage, bursting it in a shower of sparks and hot glass. The chamber plunged half into darkness. Marcus didn't shout for cover. He unclipped, launched from the rail, and crashed shoulder first into the swinging light rig before it tore free and took Evelyn's cradle with it. Metal rang through the shaft. He caught the rig with both arms, boots skidding across the deck, while two scavengers clawed at his back and helmet. Evelyn moved at the same instant, not freezing, not waiting. She slammed an emergency flare into the deck, and red fire exploded across the skiff in a hiss of smoke and chemical heat. The creatures recoiled from the light, wheeling away into the dark. Marcus heaved the broken lamp assembly overboard, and it vanished below, tumbling like a dying star. For one breath, all they heard was the chain rattle and the hard rasp of everyone pulling air through their masks. Then the scanner screamed. Evelyn stared at the display. The red trajectory line had split into violent bursts, each one farther apart than the last. Kong wasn't just moving. He was accelerating. The skiff cleared the shaft and emerged over a vast jungle basin glowing silver under drifting magma mist. Trees the size of towers bent in one direction, as if a storm had passed through them minutes earlier. In the mud far below, a trail of fresh impact craters led deeper into the wilderness, too wide, too erratic, too destructive for any normal patrol route. Marcus looked out over the wrecked green corridor cutting through the forest and tightened his grip on the rail until his knuckles went pale beneath the grime. Kong had left his kingdom behind, and whatever waited ahead had already begun changing the way he moved. Warm wind rolled up from the basin carrying the smell of crushed sap and hot stone, and below the skiff the jungle looked less like a forest than a wound carved through living green. Whole crowns of giant trees lay snapped in the same direction, their pale interiors steaming in the amber light, while the mud around them had been pounded into wide black bowls that still trembled with runoff. Evelyn leaned over the scanner mount until the blue glow washed across her face. then pointed toward the trail where the destruction suddenly forked, doubled back, and smashed through a stand of pillar vines for no reason any hunter would ever choose. "Set us down there," she said. Marcus did not answer right away. He studied the broken route, the way it zigzagged instead of driving clean toward prey or shelter, then gave a hard signal to the pilot. The skiff dropped through drifting spores and landed with a hiss on wet roots thick as bridge cables. The second the ramp hit, heat rushed in. Boots sank into warm mud. Somewhere deeper in the shattered timber, water dripped in a steady metallic rhythm, and every few seconds another branch cracked and collapsed under its own weight. Marcus moved first, rifle lowered but ready, waving the team into a tight line along the edge of the impact path. Evelyn crouched beside a crater nearly 40 feet across and pressed gloved fingers into the wall of it. Fresh, the clay still held warmth, not just from hollow Earth's air, but from force. She followed the gouge marks out of the crater and stopped at a broken trunk furred with golden-brown strands. Kongs. But the bark around it was not stripped by a controlled brace or a defensive pivot. It had been pulverized, beaten apart in a burst of repeated blows. "He didn't push through this," she murmured. "He hit it." Marcus turned as one of the researchers called out from the far side of the clearing. Wedged under a fallen canopy beast, half buried in fern pulp, lay the body of a small Titan scavenger no taller than a truck, its plated shell caved in as if a wrecking ball had dropped from the sky. 20 yards beyond it, there was another, then another. None of them had been feeding. None had been clustered in attack formation. They had simply been in the way. A low vibration moved through the ground, not from footsteps now, but from the distant collapse of something much larger farther ahead. Marcus knelt beside one of the carcasses, touched the soil, then looked at the spread of debris around it. This wasn't a fight for territory, he said. He changed direction just to go through them. That was the answer to one question at least. Kong had not left his domain to patrol. He had torn out of it with speed and force so reckless it was already turning every creature on his path into collateral. Evelyn rose and pushed deeper into the corridor before anyone could stop her. She had seen Kong hunt, posture, threaten, even rage. This was none of those. Branches were embedded sideways into stone. A boulder the size of a bus had been smashed flat against a cliff face, then struck again after impact. Nothing in the pattern spoke of instinct. It looked like momentum with no target and no end. Marcus caught up and seized her arm just as the earth ahead gave way into a shallow ravine choked with uprooted trees. At the bottom, a juvenile Meyer-Strider Titan was still alive, chest fluttering, one leg trapped beneath a slab of basalt. Its many eyes rolled wide at the sound of humans. Evelyn started down the slope, but Marcus blocked her with an outstretched forearm. Then the Meyer-Strider made a thin, broken clicking sound and dragged one claw through the mud toward a ridge on the opposite side. Not at them, toward the direction Kong had gone. On the ridge, 5 immense handprints dented the stone in a wild stagger, each one deeper than the last, as if he had nearly fallen, caught himself, then exploded forward harder. Marcus looked from the wounded Titan to the prince and made the call that changed the shape of the mission. No wider sweep. No sample stop. We track him now, direct line. The team stared at him. That meant leaving data behind, leaving the injured creature, leaving any safe pace they had planned. Evelyn held his gaze for one beat, then nodded and yanked a beacon from her pack. Instead of placing it by the Meyer-Strider for recovery, she drove it into the ravine wall facing the prince, marking Kong's route and committing all of them to it. Above the basin, another distant impact rolled through the dark like thunder trapped underground, and flocks of pale winged things burst from the canopy in terrified silence as the trail ahead bent into unmapped shadow. Blue emergency strobes pulsed through the trees ahead, faint at first, then sharper between the black trunks like a heartbeat refusing to die. The air turned colder as the corridor narrowed, and a bitter electrical smell crept over the wet jungle rot. Wrong for any place this deep in hollow earth. Marcus lifted a fist, and the team froze in ankle-deep water. Evelyn slipped past a curtain of hanging roots and saw it at once. A Monarch outpost half crushed into the rock wall, one side peeled open like a can, its antenna mast bent flat beneath something too heavy to imagine. Mud hissed on exposed cables. Steam drifted from a split generator. Nothing moved. Marcus signaled 2 researchers to cover the perimeter, then climbed the broken entry ramp with his rifle low and his shoulders tight. Evelyn went straight for the control room because one monitor inside was still flickering, throwing pale blue light over the wreckage. The floor was littered with shattered tablets, dented sample crates, and a helmet with the visor spiderwebbed white. A warning siren coughed once and died. "Power's still bleeding from backup," Evelyn said, kneeling at the central console. Her fingers came away slick with coolant and gray dust. Marcus didn't answer. He was staring at the far wall, where a Titan threat board had been caved inward by a single handprint broader than a truck hood. Not a strike in passing. A blow meant to erase. One of the researchers called out from a side bay, voice thin and shaking. They found a survivor wedged beneath a fallen storage rack, an older technician with one arm splinted in emergency foam and dried blood along his collar. His eyes snapped open the moment he heard the word Kong. He grabbed Marcus by the vest, so hard the fabric stretched. "Don't use the speakers," he rasped. "Don't call to him." Marcus crouched lower. "What happened here?" The man swallowed, breath rattling. Behind him, red warning lights reflected in a puddle and made the room look as if it were slowly filling with fire. He came out of the south passage running. Not hunting, running. His gaze drifted to nothing for a second, then jerked back. "We thought something was chasing him. We opened external scans, lit the perimeter, broadcast the pacification tones Monarch used near his territory." He shook his head once. He hit the tower first, then the gates, then everything that moved. Evelyn looked up from the console. Everything. The technician's mouth tightened. A pair of leafbacks were feeding beyond the ridge. Harmless. They always kept away from him. He went after them anyway. His hand slipped from Marcus's vest. He wasn't warning anything off. He was clearing the world in front of him. Silence pressed in after that, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal and the distant drip of water through ruptured pipes. Evelyn plugged her field drive into the console and forced the system awake. Lines of corrupted footage crawled across the monitor, then resolved into security video, smeared with static. Kong burst into frame between floodlights and rain, moving with a speed that made the image shudder. Not the measured force they knew. Not a territorial charge. He slammed one shoulder through the outer barricade without slowing, wheeled at the flash of a drone, and tore it from the air before it could climb. Another feed showed him pivot toward the leafbacks the technician had mentioned, 2 bulky herbivores already retreating, heads low, no threat at all. He drove them aside and kept going, as if anything that entered his sight became an enemy the instant he saw it. Marcus watched the footage with his jaw set hard enough to show in the strobe light. This was no trackable pattern anymore, no angry Titan defending ground. Kong had become the danger itself, and for the first time since entering the basin, Marcus saw scale replacing certainty in the faces around him. One researcher stepped back from the screen and said what none of them wanted to say. "If he reaches a migration channel," the sentence died on its own. Evelyn yanked the drive free, the monitor reflecting in her eyes. On the final frozen frame, just before the camera cut out, Kong had turned towards something deeper in the dark beyond the station. As if even after tearing through steel, signals, and living creatures, he had still been following a pull stronger than all of it. Then a low impact rolled through the stone under their boots, closer than before, and dust sifted from the broken ceiling. Marcus stood and looked toward the southern passage, where the tunnel mouth breathed cold mist into the ruined station. "We move now," he said. Whatever drew him through this place is still ahead of him. Cold mist poured through the southern passage and spread across the station floor like breath from some sleeping thing below. The air turned sharp and mineral, carrying the wet smell of stone and a faint metallic tang that didn't belong in jungle air. Marcus led with his light up, boots grinding over broken glass and bent floor panels, while behind him the surviving researchers dragged cases through the dark, every latch and strap clicking too loud in the silence. Evelyn slowed at the mouth of the tunnel when her beam caught carved lines beneath a sheet of black moss. They were not Monarch markings. She crouched, brushed the surface with a gloved hand, and the slime peeled away in long, cold strands, revealing a wall of ancient cut stone buried inside the natural rock, as if the mountain itself had been built around it. "Hold the team," she said, already moving closer. Marcus looked back at the passage ahead where distant impacts still shuddered through the floor, then made a choice and signaled everyone to kill the lamps except two. In the dim amber glow, the carvings emerged in bands. Towering ape figures, kneeling beasts, and circles cut around a jagged shape like fire trapped inside a heart. The stone felt warm under Evelyn's fingertips. Not geothermal warm, pulsing warm. She pulled a compact scanner from her pack, swept it across the symbols, and a fractured translation matrix crawled across her cracked tablet screen. Several glyphs failed. One repeated over and over. Not king, not guardian. Wrath. Ancestral Wrath. She swallowed, zoomed in, and found the sequence wrapped around the ape figure's chest and skull, then repeated beside images of entire valleys laid flat under its hands. Marcus knelt beside her, sweat cooling on his face in the mist. Tell me that doesn't mean what I think it means. Evelyn slid the beam higher. At the top of the wall, older damage scored through the carvings, as if something enormous had once tried to tear the message apart. Behind that break sat a narrow seam in the rock, too straight to be natural. It means this wasn't a legend, she said. It was a warning. She wedged a field blade into the seam and leaned her weight into it. Stone groaned. A hidden slab shifted inward, releasing a breath of sealed air so old and dry it carried dust like ash across their faces. Beyond it lay a chamber untouched by Monarch, circular, silent, and lined with pillars carved into hunched titans bowing away from a central dais. The floor was coated in a pale powder that crunched under their boots like old bone, and in the middle of the room a ring of blackened metal spikes jutted from the stone, all bent inward around an empty socket the size of a truck tire. Evelyn's light moved over the walls. The story there was simpler than the broken text outside. A ruling titan approached a burning core. Its eyes changed. Its hands turned on every living thing around it. Then the other titans did not kill it. They trapped the fire, sealed the chamber, and buried the place. One picture showed the same jagged symbol sinking beneath layers of rock, while forests grew over it. Another showed the ape alone afterward, standing in a wasteland no other creature would enter. Marcus stared at the empty socket, then toward the southern dark where another far-off tremor rolled through the basin. If the prison's empty, he said, then whatever was in here isn't dead. Evelyn's scanner chirped. A weak residue trail, fresh compared to the age of the chamber, led out through a split in the rear wall and pointed deeper into unmapped hollow earth, straight along Kong's path. She rose so fast her shoulder clipped a pillar and sent a sheet of dust whispering down. Until now they had been following destruction. Now they knew it had a source, and worse, it had a history. Marcus turned to the team and his voice hardened into command. We leave the station. Right now? No samples, no delay. He looked at Evelyn, and for a beat neither of them said what both were seeing in the carved walls. If Kong had reached whatever had once been sealed here, then they were no longer chasing a titan in a rage. They were racing something older than his memory, and it was still pulling him farther in. A deep metallic groan rolled through the stone throat of the passage, followed by a blast of hot wind that smelled like wet iron and burned resin. Dust shook loose from the ceiling in glittering sheets, and somewhere far ahead, something enormous struck rock hard enough to make the temple floor jump under their boots. Marcus snapped one hand up, stopping the team at the mouth of a jagged archway where the carved stone gave way to a vast open basin lit by rivers of blue-white energy. Evelyn moved beside him and lowered herself behind a slab of fallen pillar, her flashlight trembling across a landscape that looked clawed apart by a storm with fists. Trees the size of towers lay flattened in wide swaths. Blackened soil smoked in fresh lines. Then the basin answered with another impact, and Kong stepped through the haze. He didn't move like the Kong they had tracked across hollow earth. His shoulders were hunched too high. His breathing came in harsh bursts that echoed off the cliffs, and every few steps his hand slammed the ground, as if the earth itself had offended him. Pale blue veins of light crawled under the skin around his chest and neck, pulsing in time with the distant energy river. A horned grazer titan, one that should have fled at his scent, stumbled from behind a ridge and froze in the open. Kong saw it instantly. No warning beat. No territorial display. He hit it with a speed that made the air crack, driving it sideways through a stand of giant stone ferns. The animal tried to crawl away, shrieking into the steam, but Kong seized it, hurled it into a cliff face, and turned before it even stopped moving, already searching for the next target. Marcus swore under his breath. That's not defense. That's a sweep. Evelyn fumbled for the Monarch beacon clipped to her harness, the one calibrated for Kong's familiar response patterns. She thumbed it on. A low rhythmic pulse spread across the basin, its amber light blinking against the rock. In the past, that signal had made Kong pause, turn, assess. This time his head snapped toward it with a violence that emptied the blood from every face behind the pillar. For one suspended second, he stared straight at them. The old recognition never came. His lips peeled back. He let out a roar so raw it shredded through the chamber and sent shards of crystal pattering from the walls. Then he charged. Marcus grabbed Evelyn by the pack strap and dragged her sideways as the fallen pillar exploded where they had been an instant before. Stone grit blasted across their skin. The air filled with the bitter smell of pulverized rock. Kong's fist drove into the ground again, gouging a trench through the temple edge, and the shock wave hurled 2 researchers off their feet. Marcus shoved one back toward cover and fired a flare launcher not at Kong's face, but into a hanging cluster of luminous sacs above the basin wall. They burst in a flood of burning gel and blinding green fire. Kong flinched, not in fear, but in fury, swinging upward at the sudden light. The strike tore half the wall open and brought a rain of boulders crashing between him and the team. "Move!" Marcus shouted, voice ragged in the smoke. Evelyn didn't run immediately. Through a gap in the falling stone, she saw Kong hammer his own chest once, hard enough to stagger himself, as if something inside him was pushing against the rage and losing. Then his eyes found the flare glow again, wild and empty, and whatever had hesitated vanished. Marcus seized her arm, and together they drove the team into a narrow lava-cut fracture where the heat pressed against them like an open furnace. Behind them, Kong slammed into the rockfall, tearing a path through it instead of going around. He wasn't hunting territory now. He was hunting motion, sound, anything alive enough to answer his anger. The passage ahead forked into darkness, but the one thing that had been uncertain was gone. Kong could see them. Kong would not recognize them. And if he kept coming like this, there would be nowhere in hollow earth left to hide. Heat shimmered through the split rock like liquid glass, and every breath tasted of sulfur and hot metal. Pebbles began to dance across the floor before the next impact came, a blunt force that turned the whole fracture into a drum. Marcus threw one arm across Evelyn's path and shoved the last 2 researchers flat against the wall, just as Kong burst through the broken choke point behind them, shoulders scraping sparks from the stone, fur lit in jagged pulses by that unnatural glow under his skin. There was no warning roar this time. He moved like a collapsing mountain, fast and crooked and furious, one hand smashing into the ledge where the team had been standing a second earlier. Marcus fired a magnesium flare straight into the opposite fork. White fire hissed, smoke bit the air, and Kong's head snapped toward it. For one heartbeat, that bought them distance. Then something older answered him. From the cavern ahead, a titan rose out of the dark like a living cliff face, 6-limbed and plated in black mineral armor, its chest rumbling with a bass note that shook dust from the ceiling. It wasn't hunting Marcus or Evelyn. It planted itself in the passage and lowered its horned skull directly into Kong's path. Kong hit it without slowing down. The crash boomed through the fracture hard enough to split glowing seams along the wall. The armored titan drove all 6 limbs into the ground and held for a second, maybe 2, while steam blasted from its jaws and hot grit sprayed across Marcus's face. Then Kong tore one of the 4 limbs free of its footing, twisted, and slammed the giant beast sideways into the lava-scarred rock. The passage opened wider beyond them into a shattered basin, and what waited there was worse. Shapes emerged through curtains of ash and bioluminescent mist. 3 more great titans drawn by the violence. One winged and skeletal with membranes that flashed blue. One hulking quadruped with a crown of crystal spines. One serpentine thing coiling around a broken stone column thicker than an office tower. Hollow Earth's hidden order had finally answered, and it was too late. Evelyn grabbed Marcus by the sleeve and pulled him behind a slab of fallen basalt as the first shockwave rolled across the basin, hot wind carrying the smell of scorched moss and wet stone. The winged titan dove first, slicing down through the haze with a shriek sharp enough to sting the teeth. Kong snatched it out of the air by one wing, drove it into the ground, and the impact sent a ring of blue light racing through the cracked earth before the creature went still. The crystal-backed brute charged next, lowering its head to ram him into the basin wall. Kong met it chest to chest, boots grinding trenches through black mud, then heaved upward with a bellow that echoed off every cliff in the chamber. Crystal spines snapped free in a bright, chiming burst and scattered across the ground like shattered glass. Marcus stared over the edge of the basalt and forgot to breathe. "Nothing's slowing him down," he said, too low at first, then louder when the serpentine titan struck from the side. It wrapped around Kong's torso, tightened, and for the first time there was resistance, stone cracking under the pressure, glowing water splashing from a ruptured channel, Kong's knees dropping half a foot into the basin floor. Evelyn looked up just in time to see his eyes flare brighter. Kong drove both fists into the serpent's coils, tore the body loose, and whipped the massive creature across the basin into the crystal brute that was trying to rise. Two titans went down together. Neither got back up. Then the basin itself began to fail. Flocks of smaller creatures erupted from cliff nests and fled screaming into the red-lit sky. A shelf of hanging forest on the far side tore away and vanished into steam. The underground river that had circled the basin changed course as the impact fractures widened, pouring into new glowing cracks like blood finding open veins. This wasn't a fight for territory anymore. Every blow was breaking the machinery of the world around him. Marcus made the decision before Evelyn could stop him. He rose from cover, waved a sonic beacon over his head, and hurled it toward a ridge that still held the only stable exit. The beacon clanged once, then began pulsing with a rapid metallic cry. Kong turned toward the sound, not because he recognized it, because it moved, because it dared answer him. Evelyn saw it immediately, the path out, the line of collapse, the fact that the titans of Hollow Earth had just spent themselves trying to stop a king who no longer knew he was one. And as Kong started toward the ridge through the bodies of creatures that should have been able to hold him, the question changed from whether anything could stand in his way to what could possibly survive if he reached whatever was calling him deeper ahead. Blue-white pulses kept flickering under the ridge ahead, too regular to be lightning, too deep in the stone to be lava, and every time they flashed the air tasted metallic, like a battery held on the tongue. Dust drifted through the basin in warm sheets. Broken scales, torn moss, and black volcanic grit rasped beneath Evelyn's gloves as she slid out from behind the fallen basalt and stared past the bodies of the beaten titans. Kong was no longer charging blindly. He was being pulled. "There," she whispered, voice dry from ash. A crack had opened along the ridge where the ground had buckled under Kong's last impact, and inside it something old was shining through layers of rock like a buried heart forcing its way awake. Marcus caught her wrist before she moved. The beam on his shoulder lamp trembled over a wall of fused stone and glassy veins running toward the fracture. "You go in there alone, you don't come back." Evelyn dropped to one knee anyway, pressing a scanner against the rock. The screen spasmed with jagged peaks, matching the broken rhythm they had been following since Kong left his territory. Then she saw the pattern beneath the noise. Every pulse surged just before his direction changed, like a hook yanking on instinct older than memory. "It isn't calling him," she said, pulling the scanner away as another pulse hummed through the ground and made loose pebbles dance. "It's inflaming him. Over and over. Something in that ridge is forcing the oldest part of him to stay in control." The next flash lit carvings hidden under soot where the shattered ridge met the temple stone below. Crowned titan figures bent backward beneath branching lines that led into a single central core. No new language was needed now. The warning from the ruins had been simple all along. Hollow Earth had once locked away a source that could turn a ruler into a living stampede. Kong hit the lower slope at that exact moment, one hand burying into stone, shoulders heaving, fur smoking where the blue light crawled across him. He slammed his fist into the ridge, not out of anger this time, but hunger. The crack widened. A low tone rolled out of the opening, deep enough to shake the water trapped in nearby footprints. Marcus looked from Kong to the fracture and made the choice before she could ask for it. He unclipped the last flare charge from his belt, shoved the rifle into her hands, and pointed toward a narrow shelf spiraling under the ridge. "That path gets you under the source. If you can kill it, kill it." I'll hold him here. Evelyn's stare locked on him for half a second too long. Dust clung to the sweat on his jaw. The red status light on his chest rig blinked against the gray haze. You can't hold Kong. Not him, Marcus said, already backing away, eyes on the slope. The only way you get one shot is if he looks at me instead of that thing. He sprinted across the shattered basin before the thought could turn into argument, boots cracking over cooled lava and splintered shell. At 30 yards, he fired a flare into the dark above Kong's head. The red burst hissed and painted the ridge in blood-colored light. Kong jerked around so hard stone exploded under his feet. For one terrible beat, those eyes found Marcus and found movement and nothing else. Evelyn ran. The shelf was narrow, sharp as broken pottery under her palms, dropping into a steaming chasm that smelled of sulfur and wet iron. Above her, Marcus kept moving, not retreating, but cutting across the basin to drag Kong sideways, away from the fracture mouth. Kong roared and gave chase, each impact sending hot grit raining down the wall around her. Then the ridge opened wider, and Evelyn saw it at last beneath layers of crystalline basalt. A suspended core the size of a truck cab, wrapped in ancient metal bands split by age, pulsing blue into the stone like poison through veins. It had not awakened by accident. Something had broken its prison, and whatever waited deeper beyond the ridge was still drawing Kong forward even now. Marcus's voice snapped over the comm through a storm of static. Evelyn, I've got maybe 60 seconds before he cuts me off. She looked at the glowing core, then up toward the thunder of Kong's pursuit, and realized destroying the source would only matter if Marcus was still alive when the king came back to himself. Steam rolled up from the chasm in hot, bitter waves, turning the blue glow inside the ridge into a flicker behind curtains of white. Pebbles skittered down the shelf, then the whole wall gave a deep, grinding shudder as something enormous hit the basin below. Evelyn flattened one hand against the carved stone, felt it vibrating through her palm, and heard Marcus over the comm sucking in air between steps. He's not chasing the flares anymore, Marcus said. Wind tore half the words away. He's reading me. Down in the shattered basin, Kong came through the haze like a living avalanche, shoulders smeared with ash, chest heaving, one arm darkened by fresh burns where another titan had failed to stop him. Every stride broke old stone. Every breath came out in a low, furnace sound that rolled under the ridge and up through Evelyn's boots. Marcus sprinted across a tilted slab of black rock, tossing his shock beacon aside when Kong ignored it. Then he did the one thing no one had dared try since this nightmare began. He stopped running. He climbed onto a broken column jutting from the basin, tore off his helmet lamp, and slammed it against the metal of his field case until sparks burst bright and sharp in the dark. Here, he shouted, voice raw, arms spread wide against a king that no longer knew friend from threat. Kong's head snapped toward him. For one suspended second, the basin went still except for the hiss of steam and the ticking of falling debris. Then Kong charged. The impact of his first step knocked Marcus to one knee. He shoved himself up, grabbed the field case, and ran straight for the narrow kill zone beneath the ridge instead of away from it, forcing Kong into the one path that would keep the Titan's back turned from Evelyn. Up above, she clipped her line to a split ring of ancient metal and swung out over the chasm. Heat punched into her face. The air smelled like wet minerals and ozone. Below her, the core throbbed in its prison, blue light moving through cracked bands that looked less forged than grown. No new mystery waited there now. The carvings had already told her enough. This thing did one simple, terrible job. It took rage, fed it, and sent it back stronger. Evelyn hit the opposite ledge hard, slid on glassy stone, and crawled toward the pulsing cradle with her charges clattering against the rock. Another blow shook the ridge. She looked out through a split in the wall and saw Marcus vanish behind a curtain of dust as Kong's fist smashed the column where he had been standing. When the dust cleared, Marcus was still moving, limping now, dragging the field case by one handle. He didn't try to escape. He angled left, baiting Kong closer to the ridge mouth, closer to the line of fracture running through the ancient chamber. Now, Evelyn, he rasped. You get one shot. She wedged the last charge into the seam where blue light bled through the oldest band. The stone there was warm and slick, almost breathing under her fingers. Her thumb hovered over the trigger. If she fired too soon, the chamber might collapse with Marcus still beneath it. If she waited, Kong would reach the ridge, and there would be no chamber left to bring down. Below, a new shadow rose to meet the king, an immense, horn-crowned titan, the last of the Basin guardians, hauling itself upright from broken terraces with a bellow that shook dust from the ceiling. Its plated neck flashed amber through the smoke. It lowered its head and rammed Kong broadside with enough force to turn the ground. For the first time in minutes, Marcus disappeared from Kong's line. He staggered into the open, dropped the field case, and looked up toward Evelyn's ledge. Even from that distance, the command in his stare was unmistakable. "Do it." Kong answered the challenge with a roar so deep the blue veins in the chamber stuttered in time with it. He locked both hands around the guardian's horns and drove it backward across the basin, heel furrows cutting through stone, each step bringing the struggle directly toward the ridge and the glowing heart buried inside it. Evelyn hit the trigger. A white flash punched through the chamber. Metal bands shrieked. The core split with a sound like a mountain inhaling, and the whole ridge began to come apart while Kong, still overpowering the last titan in hollow earth, turned toward the blast. Heat burst out of the broken ridge in dry white pulses, and the air filled with the sting of burned stone and ozone. Blue light that had throbbed through the chamber a second ago now fluttered and died in ragged spasms, like a heart losing its rhythm. Evelyn slammed one arm across her face as shards of black rock rattled off the ledge around her boots. Below, the basin shook under a sound deeper than thunder. Kong had turned toward the blast. For one terrible second, all that wild force still lived in him. He released the guardian titan and roared into the collapsing light, chest heaving, shoulders hunched, every muscle drawn tight, as if he wanted to tear the mountain open and drag the vanished power back out of it. Then the roar cracked, not in weakness, in confusion. Marcus saw it from the shattered basin floor, half buried in dust, one hand braced against a split slab of stone. Kong staggered 3 steps through the falling debris, smashing blindly into a pillar of rock that burst apart under his shoulder. He swung again at shadows that were no longer there. The guardian titan, battered and barely standing, lowered its horned head but did not charge. It backed away, slow and wary, while the basin kept trembling under Kong's weight. That was the first thing that changed. Not the destruction, the direction of it. Kong stopped hunting everything around him and began fighting something no one else could see. Evelyn forced herself to the edge of the fractured chamber. "Marcus!" Her voice came out raw in the hot wind. He looked up through the dust. She pointed, not at the dying core, but at Kong. The giant ape had dropped to one knee. His fingers dug into the stone hard enough to leave trenches. Blue traces crawled across his fur and then flickered out in thin, fading lines. He struck his own chest once, furious, then clawed at the ground as if trying to anchor himself against something pulling from the inside. Marcus understood before she had to say it. No titan had ever been strong enough to stop him because the thing driving him had never been another body in his path. It had been buried in him, feeding on the oldest part of him, turning rule into rage and instinct into ruin. Marcus rose, limping, and took 2 steps forward, but Evelyn was already moving. She slid down the broken slope into the basin, palms skinned on hot gravel, breath catching in the sulfur-thick air. "Easy," she said, though her voice trembled against the enormous silence between Kong's gasping roars. "Easy, come on." He heard her. That was the second change. Not recognition all at once, not some miracle of instant peace, but hesitation. His arm, raised to strike the ground again, stopped in midair. Dust streamed off his knuckles. One eye fixed on her through the haze, bloodshot and furious and lost, and for a moment the whole hollow earth seemed to hold still with them. Evelyn took another step. Marcus did not call her back. He planted himself instead between Kong and the collapsing ravine, ready to die there if the rage surged again. But this time he did not lead. He held the line and let her reach him. Kong leaned forward with a low, broken growl that rolled across the basin like loose rock. His free hand came up to his head. Then both hands did. He gripped the sides of his skull, elbows flaring, and let out a roar that was no longer aimed at an enemy. It was pain. It was refusal. It was the sound of something ancient being forced out. The last blue light burst from his eyes and vanished into the steam. His shoulders dropped. The basin kept shedding stone into the chasm. The guardian titan retreated into the mist. Far off, the calls of smaller creatures, silenced for too long, began returning one by one. Kong stayed on one knee, breathing in deep ragged pulls. When Evelyn finally stood close enough to touch him, her hand looked impossibly small against the dark fur of his wrist. He flinched at first. Then he went still. Marcus watched the giant fingers unclench from the rock. Watched the shattered ground stop breaking under him. Watched Kong lift his head, not like a beast searching for the next thing to destroy, but like a king waking up inside the wreckage of what his own hands had done. He looked across the ruined basin, at the fallen guardian, the split ridge, the graves of stone his fury had made, and he did not roar again. He rose slowly, every movement heavy, and turned away from the dead chamber at the heart of the mountain. Hollow Earth had not been saved by a stronger titan, or a bigger weapon, or a wall tall enough to hold him back. In the end, the only thing that could end the nightmare was the moment Kong faced the fury inside himself and chose not to carry it any farther.